Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Abraham Lincoln, Part 1, A Humble Beginning. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th U.S. President. He was elected in 1860, re-elected in 1864. Some consider him the best president along with George Washington, or the best two presidents, those two. They called him the Rail Splitter, the Great Emancipator, and Honest Abe, among other nicknames. As a young man, he was a Whig in the Whig Party, and then he joined the Republican Party later in life and was elected the first Republican president elected. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, struggled with depression, was a good person. He and Mary had 4 sons, no daughters. Their sons were Robert, Ed, Willie, and Tad. Abraham Lincoln had a very poor upbringing, very humble, rural upbringing. He was 6'4" inches tall, the tallest president, and he was the first of 4 presidents to be assassinated while president. And the other 3 were James A. Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. And of course, Abraham Lincoln was president during the U.S. Civil War, and he prosecuted the U.S. Civil War to a successful conclusion, which kept the United States one country. That was his major achievement, was basically winning the war, which losing the Civil War would have meant the country dividing into 2. So he was involved in the most tragic time period in American history, the very horrific Civil War with all the people dying and suffering. Now, among his 4 sons, he and Mary's 4 sons, their oldest, Robert, lived to the ripe old age of 82, but the other 3 died young. Eddie died at age 3. Willie died at age 11 during President Lincoln's time in the White House, and Tad died at age 18, 6 years after Abraham Lincoln died, so still young and very tough for. So in other words, Mary lost 3 of her 4 sons very young. Abraham Lincoln did not smoke, drink, swear, or gamble. As I said, he was elected in 1860 and re-elected in 1864, although he only served a very short time in his second term, from March 4th to April 15th of 1865, so only a month and 11 days. Very short time. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. He also spent part of his childhood in Indiana, then his family moved again to Illinois when he was a young man. He served in the Black Hawk War. His wife was Mary Todd from Kentucky. Again, he was the first Republican president, and he was a very wise man, very humane, and as I said, he prosecuted the Civil War to preserve the Union, to keep the United States one country. He pledged federal help to recover fugitive slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation made the Civil War a crusade to end slavery. Initially, the war was always to keep the country one, but eventually the Civil War became a war to end slavery as well. He was murdered 1 month into his second term, shortly after the Civil War ended. His grandfather was killed by Indians in Kentucky when his father was a boy. His mother died when he was only 9 years old. He had a lot of tragedy in his life. He had very little education, but became very highly self-educated. And most of his childhood was basically an awful lot of farm work. He became a very successful lawyer, and Springfield, Illinois became his home as an adult. His mother's name was Nancy Hanks Lincoln, and again, she died when he was only 9. His stepmother was Sarah Johnston, who was a wonderful person and really became his mother. Very kind, played a very positive role in his childhood. Abraham Lincoln developed a love of books as a boy and a love of learning. He would walk miles to borrow books from neighbors. A childhood hero was George Washington. Of course, those two are linked today in the American culture as the greatest presidents. He worked as a grocery store clerk, a farmhand, a ferry boat rower. He was physically very strong, very funny, he had a wonderful sense of humor, and a very good storyteller. He also wrestled as a young man, of course, being physically strong. At age 19, he saw New Orleans on a trip down the Mississippi, and that was a major exposure to slavery, which he hated. And again, his 4 sons, 3 died young. member of, and again, we're repeating ourselves, he was a member of the Whig Party, which eventually died out in the 1850s, and then joined the Republican Party. He was an honest man. He was a just man. He believed the abolitionists who were fighting to end slavery did more harm than good. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation, which he released on September 22nd, 1863, this freed the slaves in the Confederacy, and the states under rebellion. And July of 1863 was the Battle of famous Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And then, of course, Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, a speech he gave in November of 1863 on the battlefield, which became a cemetery. And then, of course, the famous words of his Gettysburg Address: "This nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth." In other words, the Civil War was a test to see if democracy could be preserved and if the rule of the people could be preserved in a country. In 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was finally the general that President Lincoln found to help him win the war. He was reelected in 1864, President Lincoln, against the Democratic candidate George McClellan, who actually had been the early popular, powerful general who was very ineffective. In his inaugural address, he said the famous words, with malice towards none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds." And the war, of course, the Civil War ended April 9th, 1865, when the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. President Lincoln was assassinated by popular actor John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington City, and he died the next day. President Lincoln, on April 15th, 1865. He was buried in Springfield, Illinois. And then there's the famous Walt Whitman poem, "O Captain, my Captain, on the deck my Captain lies, fallen cold and dead." Now, some American history. New England. Now, the United States during President Lincoln's time was mostly focused on what's now the eastern part. New England reportedly was settled by Puritans who fled persecution in England and persecution by the Anglican Church and King Charles I. On the other hand, the southern states were settled primarily, supposedly, by Cavaliers or supporters of the king, who were the people who were expelled by Oliver Cromwell. So there was this supposedly conflict between the Puritan North and Cavalier South, and the Puritans being reformers and self-righteous against the Cavaliers in the South who believed in honor, hospitality, and chivalry. This is an explanation, part explanation for the Civil War. Now, one of the religious groups was the Quakers, who believed in reconciliation and peace and unity, and trying to unite the conflict between Puritans and Cavaliers. Abraham Lincoln stressed his Quaker background, hoping that would bring sympathy in the North and the South. In 1786, Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, while planting corn on their Kentucky farm, was shot and killed by a Shawnee Indian. His son, Mordecai, who was age 14, shot and killed the Indian. Now, Abraham Lincoln's father, Thomas Lincoln, was 6 years old, and he was there at that time. So his grandfather died at age 42, so that was very, very tough for Abraham Lincoln's father, losing his father so young. 1807, February 10th, Sarah Lincoln gave birth to their first child. Sarah Lincoln was born, the first child of Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, the parents of Abraham Lincoln. 2 years later, on February 12th, Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin, 16 feet by 18 feet with a dirt floor, a large fireplace, and one window of greased paper. Abraham Lincoln's father Thomas was honest, hardworking, and God-fearing, and respected by all of his neighbors. Again, Abraham Lincoln was born February 12th near Hodgenville, Kentucky, son of Thomas Lincoln, a poor farmer. His mother was Nancy Hanks Lincoln. He was the second child. Again, his older sister was Sarah. And he had been named after his grandfather, who had been killed by the Shawnee Indian in Kentucky. Again, this one-room log cabin with a dirt floor and did not have a glass window. There was a third child, Thomas, who died in infancy. Supposedly, Abraham Lincoln was embarrassed about his log cabin origins, never liked to talk about it. One of his law partners, or near the end of before he became president, William Herndon said if Abraham Lincoln talked about his boyhood or his parents, quote, it was with great reluctance and significant reserve. There was something about his origin he never cared to dwell on. 1816, Abraham was 7 years old, and the family moved to Indiana, away from the slave state of Kentucky. There were land title controversies in Kentucky. They wanted to get away from slavery. Biographer Ronald C. White wrote, quote, early on, no matter how bleak and limiting life on his family's farm became, he learned to rely on his books and his imagination to satisfy his curiosity and intellect. Now, Abraham Lincoln had this to say about his self-education, quote, if your endeavors are deficient, it is in vain that you have tutors, books, and all the external apparatus of literary pursuits. You must love learning if you would possess it. In order to love it, you must feel its delights. In order to feel its delights, you must apply it, however irksome at first, closely, constantly, and for a considerable time. If you have resolution enough to do this, you cannot but love learning, for the mind always loves what it has been so long steadily and voluntarily attached. Habits are formed which render what was at first disagreeable not only pleasant but necessary. As President, Abraham Lincoln, according to his son Robert, carried constantly with him a volume of William Shakespeare's plays. As President, Abraham Lincoln loved the works of William Shakespeare. One of his favorite childhood books was Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Again, his father, Thomas, was hardworking. He was a carpenter and a farmer, respected by his neighbors, sober. He accumulated land, paid his taxes, and sat on juries. Now Abraham, his time in school was very limited. Briefly, 1815 and 1816, when he could be spared from the family chores, along with his sister Sarah, in a log schoolhouse on the Cumberland Road. This was between ages 11 and 15, between the winter harvest and the spring plowing. Biographer Stephen B. Oates wrote, quote, as Abraham Lincoln labored in the fields, he dreamed of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and came to idolize them as heroic men who had shaped the course of history. In 1816, as an adult, Abraham Lincoln wrote a poem regarding his childhood in Indiana, quote, when first my father settled there, 'twas then the frontier line. The panther's scream filled night with fear, and bears preyed on the swine. Age 8, he was in 1817. His father needed Abraham's help in clearing the trees and planting corn. Abraham Lincoln said he was, quote, large of his age, and had an axe put into his hands at once. And from that till within his 23rd year, he was constantly handling that most useful instrument, less, of course, in plowing and harvesting seasons. So he spent much of his childhood with an axe cutting down trees, clearing the forest, so his father could have a farm to grow crops. 1818, his mother, Nancy, died when he was 9 years old, and it wasn't too long before Tom remarried Sarah Bush Johnston, who became Abraham's stepmother, and really was a very loving mother to him. Years later, Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to a bereaved child who'd lost a father, quote, in this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony, because it takes them unawares. I have had experience enough to know what I say. His mother had died of what they called the milk sickness. they allowed the cows to run free in the forest, and these cows apparently ate a poisonous white snake root plant, and then they transmitted that the cows didn't get sick, but then their milk apparently was poisonous from eating that plant, and his mother died from that. December of 1819, Thomas Lincoln, his father, married Sarah Bush Johnson, who was a widow with 3 children, Elizabeth, who was 13, and John, and then Matilda, who was 8. Ronald C. White wrote, quote, "The real mending that Sarah brought was the healing of 2 broken families. Her impact was enormous. She brought order to a household. More important, she brought love and concern for young Abraham. Lincoln was developing an insatiable hunger for learning." So yes, this stepmother, Sarah, was very, very important. Wonderful, very loving stepmother. There's a story when Abraham Lincoln was 10 years old. He carried a sack of cornmeal to have it milled. A sack of corn to a mill to have it ground into cornmeal. A 2-mile walk. And then at this corn mill, there was a horse walking in a circle, moving the apparatus to grind the corn. And Lincoln said, he's 10 years old, he said, "Get up, you lazy old devil." And then at one point he said, "Get up," and the horse kicked. Apparently Lincoln was behind the horse. The horse kicked him, and he lost consciousness. He was taken home, woke up the next morning, and continued his thought, "You lazy old devil." So that's a good story. Another story, when Abraham Lincoln was a boy, there were boys who were putting hot coals on the back of a terrapin. A terrapin is a turtle. And so this was cruel, animal cruelty. And Lincoln knocked the coals off the terrapin and scolded them for what they were doing, which showed that he had courage and kindness and good character. He cared about this suffering terrapin turtle. Very kind man, very humane person. David S. Reynolds, another biographer, wrote, quote, "Abraham Lincoln spent so much time spinning yards and telling jokes from his Indiana youth to his many years on the Illinois law circuit through his time as president that storytelling and humor stand out as preferred modes of public communication for him." His father actually was a great storyteller, Thomas, and Abraham would listen to these stories, and then he would tell the stories based on what he could remember to his friends. So storytelling was a big part of his life, and telling jokes. Another biographer, David Herbert Donald, wrote, quote, "Sarah brought with her the gift of love." This is Abraham's stepmother. "Sarah was able to blend the 2 families harmoniously. She treated her own children and the Lincoln children with absolute impartiality. She grew especially fond of Abraham. Starved for affection, Abraham returned her love. He called her Mama, and he never spoke of her except in the most affectionate terms." Abraham Lincoln had this to say about his stepmother, Sarah, quote, "She had been his best friend in this world, and no man could love a mother more than he loved her." Ronald C. White, another biographer, wrote, quote, "Young Abe begged, borrowed, and then devoured a small library of books. Each book that Lincoln read by the fireplace in Indiana became a log in the foundation of the schoolhouse of his mind." Now, as a boy, Lincoln wrote a poem, and it went like this, quote, "Abraham Lincoln is my name, and with my pen I wrote the same. I wrote in both haste and speed, and left it here for fools to read." Ronald C. White wrote, quote, "The books young Lincoln read tell us he was drawn to morality, tales of the triumph of good over evil. Above all, what tied his books together was the possibility that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. At some point in Indiana, Abraham realized that he was different from the other boys he knew. He delighted in listening to adult conversations, often turning the ideas he heard over and over in his mind as he fell asleep. Although thoroughly taking part in the young masculine world of wrestling, running, and jumping, he was also carving out an interior world of intellectual curiosity, reading and memorization and imagination. What could be better than traveling with William Shakespeare and Bunyan to England, with Robert Burns to Scotland, and Lord Byron to Italy? His cousin Dennis Hanks wrote, quote, Abe was getting hungry for books, reading everything he could lay his hands on. It was a story that he would carry a book when he was working, and which he would read when he would rest. Especially walking, plowing a field, he would go to the end of the furrow and read a little bit and then come down the next furrow. Again, he read Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, Aesop's Fables. He loved that. He read those many times. And he got this quote, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. And then one of his favorite quotes was from William Shakespeare's Hamlet, quote, Oh, my offense is rank, it smells to heaven. That was regarding Claudius's murder of Hamlet's father. He also enjoyed reading a biography of Benjamin Franklin. In the mid-1820s, Abraham Lincoln read The Life of George Washington by Mason Locke Weems, which was a popular biography of George Washington. And a copy reached their home in Pigeon Creek, southern Indiana. Thomas Lincoln and his teenage son, again, his father was Thomas, and he was a teenager at this time, only very little schooling. The biography of George Washington was one of the first books he read. And regarding this author, Mason Locke Weems' account of the Battle of Trenton, New Jersey, in December of 1776 in the American Revolution, quote, all fixed themselves on my memory more than any single revolutionary event. There must have been something more than common that those men struggled for. So you see his admiration for George Washington. Now there's reports that he had conflict with his father. His father, of course, they did become estranged, and they had different ideas about life. His father did not share his interest in learning. And his father was having, when he was a young fellow, was having health trouble, financial trouble, and he really needed Abraham to help. And he thought that Abraham spent too much time reading books. When Abraham was 16 years old, he was 6'2", 160 pounds, and he really wasn't enthusiastic about farm work. He was more interested in reading books, writing poetry, and of course this led to some friction with his father and estrangement with his father. Regarding patriotism, Abraham Lincoln wrote, quote, Many free countries have lost their liberty, and ours may lose hers. But if she shall be it my proudest plume, not that I was the last to desert, but that I never deserted her. So he was a strong, very patriotic American. And, of course, the words that meant the most to him came from the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Biographer William Lee Miller wrote, quote, Abraham Lincoln would make the Declaration of Independence the constant reference point of his argument for equality. Age 16 in 1825, Abraham Lincoln was working for area farmers as a rail splitter, chopping wood rails for fences. A lot of hard work from sunrise to sunset. He supposedly could cut 400 rails in a day. The rails were 10 feet long, 4 inches wide. He was paid 25 cents a day, money that went to his father. In 1828, in January, his sister Sarah, age 21, died giving birth. So his only full sibling. He lost his older sister Sarah, so that was very tough. That same year, he worked as a deckhand on a riverboat, bringing farm produce to New Orleans. They started out going down the Mississippi. They started out in Rockport, Indiana. It was a trip of 1,200 miles on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. And when they got there, they were instructed to purchase sugar, tobacco, and cotton. He was paid $8 a day for that trip. 1830, the Lincoln family moved again in the spring from Indiana to Illinois. And during the trip, they had a small dog that they brought with them. And the dog was somehow fell behind and was not missed until they crossed a swollen, ice-filled stream. And then when they got across the stream, and then this dog appeared on the other side, whining and yelping. the story goes that Lincoln's father wanted to continue and leave the dog, and Abraham, who was such a humane person, he objected. He crossed the stream in the cold water and returned with the dog under his arm. Lincoln said, quote, "His frantic leaps of joy and other evidences of a dog's gratitude amply repaid me for all the exposure I had undergone." Again, like his story with the terrapin. So this was after his family moved to Illinois. Illinois became his home for the rest of his life, of course, except for his time in Washington City. He became eventually, in 1830, he moved to New Salem, Illinois, trying to carve a life for himself, and was a clerk in a store there. He lived in New Salem for 6 years, till 1837. He wanted to get away from the family farm. He did not want to be a farmer. And now, 1831, Chicago only had a population of 60. So this New Salem was, the young Abraham Lincoln on his own, this small town on the Sangamon River. And he tried different jobs during these years. He was a carpenter. Again, he worked on a riverboat, store clerk. He was a soldier. The next 10 years, for part of that time, he was a merchant, postmaster, blacksmith, surveyor, lawyer, and politician. So he tried different things. In 1831, there was this Denton Offutt store in New Salem. They sold dry goods, seals, tools, saddles, guns, sugar, salt, coffee, eggs, vegetables, and barrels of liquor. And Abraham was a clerk in the store, he was paid $15 a month. Bill Green was an assistant, and Abraham and Green slept among the crates and barrels in the back of the storeroom. Abraham was very strong physically from all this farm work that he'd done over the years. And he got into an arm wrestling match with a local tough guy named Jack Armstrong, and it was a draw, and he earned respect from that match. That same year, 1831, the Nat Turner slave rebellion broke out in Virginia, and the entire South was shook to its foundations. And the belief became popular in the South that the abolitionist movement was promoting slave rebellion. Abraham Lincoln disagreed with the tactics of abolitionists. He considered them strident, uncompromising, and they would condemn Southerners as sinners, and he didn't believe in that those methods. Abraham Lincoln believed in winning people through persuasion and being kind and unassuming. Lincoln said, quote, "A drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall." David Herbert Donald wrote regarding Abraham Lincoln in New Salem, Illinois, quote, "Everyone grew very fond of this hard-working and accommodating young man, so able and so willing to do any kind of work." He had an encounter with a black man, a Haitian named William de Florville, who had no money and was on his way to Springfield, Illinois. His profession was a barber, and Lincoln saw him on his way. And eventually he found folks. He promoted this Haitian immigrant to help him get his barber business going. He was called Billy the Barber, and he became a friend. He actually cut Lincoln's hair for many years, this Haitian fellow named William de Florville. And he did establish a barber shop in Springfield. Abraham Lincoln got his hair cut there for the rest of his life in Springfield. And he became Billy's lawyer and friend. That concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time with the fascinating life of Abraham Lincoln. You might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History, with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. So far, we've made 715 history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. If you live in Metro Manila, Philippines, and are looking for a high school, you might consider Restless Educational Center. Restless is located on Allenby Street, not far from the corner of P. Guevara and Wilson Street in San Juan, Metro Manila, Philippines. At Restless, we specialize in helping young people who have had difficulty in the larger traditional traditional high schools. At Restless, we are more than a school. We are a warm, supportive community, and we strive to be creative and innovative so the students enjoy going to school and enjoy learning. And the website is restless.education, RESALEST. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.